right, it was first held on April 22nd back in 1970. I'm talking about Earth Day. And today we're celebrating Earth Day yet again. And to help us get some more information about how that affects us, I want to welcome Ian Wallace, our very own meteorologist right here at TTT Limited. Good morning, Ian.
Hello, good morning.
How are you doing this morning?
How are you?
Yeah, all right, Ian. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, I can.
All right. So this has been a strange year. Besides the pandemic, I'm talking about the weather. We've had the wettest dry season ever. We have volcanoes erupting. What does Earth Day mean for us this year in particular? Does it mean anything different, or should we pay attention to anything different?
Okay. Well, I suppose the Earth Day, which being commemorated through the United Nations, they're now using the Earth Day, which is the International Mother Earth Day. So for April the 22nd, the idea that the Earth obviously needs a restoration, and that there is the likelihood of us seeing more extreme events more frequently. So this April 22nd basically is that day in which we can obviously pay attention and focus onto the weather, climate, as well as generally the environment. So as a meteorologist, it ties into those other various internationally observed days, such as World Water Day, World Meteorological Day, World Environment Day. So they all come together, and I suppose it puts a focus on weather, climate, and particularly environmental issues.
Ian, what do you think has contributed to the climate change that we've been experiencing over the past few months?
Well, yes. Obviously, for the past few months, we obviously have to go back through the decades, because last decade was one of the warmest on record, and 2020 was one of the warmest, even though we had the cooling of the La Niña phenomenon. So over the past decades, we've seen those average global temperatures on the Earth rising, and that's directly linked to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this concentration of your greenhouse gases, it's rising steadily since the time of the Industrial Revolution. And basically, this is due to the burning of the fossil fuels, as well as the changes in land use. They're basically leading to increasing global temperatures. So there's urgent action needed, particularly to reduce greenhouse gases, probably to obviously enhance the ability to remove some of the carbon dioxide and those gases out of the atmosphere. And we also possibly have to adapt to change. You talked about the changes that we've been seeing. In the Caribbean, we've seen extremes in temperature in 2020. In fact, there were major heat waves occurring in April and September last year. In Cuba, they got a new national record. That was 39.7 degrees Celsius, and that was back in April 12th, 2020.
Right.
And there were records as well for Dominica as well as Grenada. So, I mean, this is, it's becoming a bit more usual, unfortunately. Of course, for us here in the Caribbean, if you could imagine that Dominica got a daytime high of 35.7 degrees Celsius. And then you look at Puerto Rico, which hits 37.8 degrees Celsius last year in September. We are seeing more extremes in terms of the heat and the heat waves that are occurring in the Caribbean. You talk about whether this is normal. Well, what we get accustomed to in terms of our seasons, we use those seasons to plant, to replenish reservoirs, etc. But when it becomes the unusual, then we have to begin to adapt to that. So unfortunately, it's adaptation that we are obviously trying to achieve when we talk about looking at the environment as well as the Earth's atmosphere.
It's very interesting. Is there a way forward that you can prescribe or recommend in terms of what do we need to do to get back on track, to get the environment going in the way that is beneficial to us all, and not just having to adapt to these changes? I know that we've clearly ruined things. We as a people, we have already ruined a lot of things. But is there a way to fix it?
Well, I suppose, yes, there is. There's always a way to fix it. Some measures are more extreme than others. But the Paris Climate Agreement basically said that we would try to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees or less, but ideally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason why I'm saying that there is hope, because that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the threshold for us here in the Caribbean, as well as small island developing states, to guard against this climate change. And in fact, that 1.5 degrees Celsius level was argued for and put forward by the Caribbean states. So the Caribbean scientists at the CARICOM Climate Change Center, as well as the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, all of those are climate scientists, etc., basically proved that 1.5 degrees Celsius was our threshold in the Caribbean. So the idea that we as small islands can have that impact on a global stage means that we can also have an impact on trying to get emissions to be lowered, etc. And those emissions, there are goals for those emissions to be lowered, and there have been some lowering of the emissions, but obviously we have to do more. So there's always hope. It all depends on the extremes to which we want to go. How quickly are we going to cut our carbon emissions? And those persons who are now developing in those industries and the green industries and so on, how can they get help to accelerate that change forward?
Okay, we've also seen an increase in things like agriculture, especially during this pandemic, where people have decided, they're going to plant their own things. And I would imagine that everybody taking that initiative to be able to plant things and grow their own crop would help the environment as well, and the weather, not so?
Well, yes, it does. I mean, obviously, any additional greening of your space, obviously, of course, in terms of on a larger scale of replanting forests which have been denuded by deforestation, as well as through slash and burn agriculture and so on. If you can obviously replace all of those areas which usually would take up the carbon dioxide, then obviously we'll put ourselves in a better place. So some persons have concreted their front yard and their backyard, and they've made it into patios and that sort of thing. And obviously that only works for a while, because as we've noticed, we are at the mercy of various things which nature can throw at us. And therefore, if we can go back to how things, not necessarily to a prehistoric way, but in terms of using your concrete, at least putting part of it and growing your vegetables, or at least not paving over the entire backyard. The idea of keeping some green spaces around, because it also helps to lower the temperature within a home. So if you have grass around you or trees around you, you will find that your annual temperature around your residence will actually be lower than it would be if you just had complete concrete, because concrete obviously absorbs a lot of heat. And the same thing applies to cities as well. You have an urban heat island effect. So the more concrete and glass that you have around you, the more likely you are to get higher than normal temperatures within that area. So many cities have actually started to green their spaces, and also to provide the roofs that are on top of buildings, etc. They've made those into gardens as well. So you're right. If you can just grow your own food, you can have some food security. But you could also make life more comfortable by lowering temperatures around you.
Fantastic. I want to ask quickly before we go, though, with regards to the volcano erupting in St. Vincent, and the ash that would have been spewed into the atmosphere and going into circulation, and spread to places like Barbados and whatnot. How does that affect what's coming, like in terms of the environment and in terms of the weather, especially?
Okay. Well, the volcanic eruptions, unfortunately, they won't be going away anytime soon, as the seismologists at UWI say. And in St. Vincent, they've become ready to deal with such a volcanic hazard. So they've had many years, decades actually, of preparation following the last eruption. So they are well positioned in terms of how they how to be able to cope. But obviously, once you have hazards such as that, you also have to take into account that every time there is an eruption, you're going to get a disruption in your normal activities. So with us here in Trinidad and Tobago and the Southern Caribbean, obviously they monitor the situation quite closely. And this last eruption was a good example in preparedness, because an alert was issued the day before, following months of observation, and that allowed thousands of people to be evacuated using what we call the Common Alerting Protocol, which is part of disaster risk reduction. So you find that the hazards that we have, we are looking at them, and they get observed, and they get prepared against, as it were, so you can safeguard lives and property. So in terms of the weather, the volcanic ash goes up into the air, and obviously it causes disruptions in terms of cutting out sunlight, but also it affects air travel as well as sea travel. But the thing about volcanic ash is that once it gets into the atmosphere, it can actually get pulled along by these high-level winds called jet streams all across the globe. So in fact, the ash that left St. Vincent reached South Asia, India, and it's continued to move east across the globe. And then at the lower levels, you obviously have this significant ashfall that falls over neighboring islands. So you find that St. Vincent's top third, the northern third, is basically just completely covered with ash and pyroclastic flows and so on. And then you have it spilling over to Barbados in the same
Ian, unfortunately, we have to take a sharp cut for the news at 7 o'clock. But thank you so much for joining us this morning and for sharing this information with us. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Ian Wallace, our very own meteorologist here on TTT. Go to the news right now.